One of the things I think that's misinformation, and I see it everywhere, is that you always know you have mold because you will smell it. And that's not always the case. So that would be one myth, is that definitely if you smell mold, if you smell mustiness, you do have it. Likewise, you cannot see it and still have it.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Toda Labrador. This is episode 49, and my guest is Cheryl Ciecko. Cheryl is a licensed architect. She has a bachelor's from the University of Illinois and a master's from the University of Minnesota. She brings her architectural background and experience to bear on the topic of mold. Most of us see mold as an unsightly annoyance, but Cheryl knows better. She helps us understand the threat it can pose to our health. Before we get into the conversation, we want to take a moment and thank our sponsors. Wise Traditions is supported in part by Green Pasture Products. Green Pasture Products offering fermented cod liver oil, concentrated butter oil, and coconut oil in a variety of products and blends. Visit greenpastureproducts.com. And by the Weston A. Price Foundation. They're holding their big conference this week. Go to westonaprice.org for details on how to get into the live streaming and follow them on social media. Go to @WestonAPrice on Twitter and Instagram. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Cheryl.
Hi, Hilda. Thank you for having me.
I understand you have spoken around the nation and the world about mold, and that your passion, if I can say it that way, for this subject started with your own family. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, my story actually started 12 years ago when my daughter, we moved to a house that was meant to be a temporary place while we were going to build another house. And my daughter started having migraine headaches, and she was 10 years old. So that was very concerning and very odd. And then she would also have these coughing fits everywhere. So it wasn't just in our house. And we did CAT scans and all the rest. And ultimately, she was diagnosed with full-on asthma. She had inhalers at school and at home. And it was just very strange the way it came on. And then I'm a licensed architect. And part of having a license in architecture is you have to have continuing education every year. And I'd gone to a presentation on mold in buildings, not really realizing it would be connected, and hearing some stories at that presentation about all the different kinds of symptoms that could result, or health issues that could result from mold in buildings, and realized that there might be something there for my own family. And so then I started investigating further and found the right people to help me, made some mistakes along the way, but ultimately we found Aspergillus mold in our ductwork.
So hold on, let's back up for a second. So you're sitting in this presentation as an architect, and they're talking about mold in buildings, and probably slowly a light bulb starts turning on, right?
That's exactly what happened. When they started talking about all the different kinds of health issues that it could be, not just, sneezing and coughing when you walked in a space, and the fact, this was the most interesting thing to me, and the fact that you could have symptoms everywhere, even though you were only exposed in one place.
Oh.
And if it was a place that you spent a lot of time, and so if it's a place where you sleep, and sleeping is a big part of our day, it's about a third of our day for most people, and that then you become hypersensitive to where you're actually sensitive in a lot of other places that may have mold as well, or may have other biotoxins as well, but you're hypersensitive, and so you're reacting everywhere, and it's hard for you to tell that it's really coming from one location more than another. Water damage, I knew what to look for that in terms of the basement and everything else, but it did not ever occur to me. The other light bulb moment was you can have mold in your metal ductwork, because what's the food source?
Oh, and then, so you got home, well, I guess it wasn't the same day, but you decided to investigate your ductwork.
Yeah, so then I started making phone calls to find out how to test this. And I was at a presentation that was about commercial buildings, so I had to figure out how to convert the knowledge that I had learned and find people who could do it for me or help me out do the testing. in a residential setting. So we ended up finding someone that came and did a swab test inside of our ductwork, our metal ductwork, and they did find Aspergillus mold. And if anybody wants to look up Aspergillus mold in the right percentages, it's something that can actually kill people.
Oh.
So it's a very dangerous mold. And then she was 10, and she is genetically predisposed, we know now, but we didn't know that then. But young people, children, babies, and older people are more susceptible. So someone that maybe wasn't susceptible at one point could become susceptible later on. So there's a lot of complexity to that. But my husband and I have 3 sons and a daughter. Only my daughter was affected. My husband and my sons were not, at least we didn't think so at the time. But in retrospect, I see some things that I think were probably related. And then later on, so we recovered from that, and it took her about a year to recover once we got rid of the mold. Some setbacks along the way. And then my husband got sick later. So that was 2004. Then in about 2012, my husband got really sick, and there's some blood work now that you can do, and his blood work was showing mold. And we couldn't figure out where he could be getting it from, because now we're living in a different place. And he wasn't probably getting it at our house at that time, but it was an environmental exposure outside where we did an ice skating rink. And we live in Chicago, so we do an ice skating rink, and he picked up the liner too late in the spring. And so the underside of the liner had a lot of bacteria, not really bacteria, mold, fungus growing on it. And it was a windy day, and he got a big whiff, and it just really took him down. But a lot of this, I look at it as you have this bucket, and people can take in these toxins until at some point they can't. And that point where everybody can't, or the bucket kind of overflows and you start having health effects, is different for everybody. And so then fast forward a little bit more, and then I started having some more issues, health issues myself as well. And mine showed mold. And so then it was like, okay, we must have it somewhere else then. And sure enough, in our own home that I built and designed to be mold resistant, we had a plumbing leak. So as much as you can watch everybody and design all the details correctly, there is the potential. These are human beings working on something, a building outside, and lots of people involved usually, and somebody can make a mistake.
So Cheryl, it sounds like you're saying that even if precautions are taken, mold might still grow in a building.
Yes, there's things that a building is like a human being, that it ages, and it's a living, breathing thing. And there's weather events, and there's a kid can put their Matchbox car, flush it down the toilet, and the toilet overflows, or a wax seal around the toilet might leak, or something changes in the environment, or a wind event blows some shingles off your roof. I mean, there's all kinds of things that can happen. So vigilance is really important. And so even with all the best intentions and the best designs, the homeowner, the building owner has to be always vigilant and aware of things that can come up, and address them as soon as possible. Now, our situation was very, very minor, but it actually was very toxic. So we had a very small amount of mold, but the mold that we had was very toxic, which we ended up discovering as well when even the tile guy who was working on replacing the area that needed to be replaced got sick for 2 days, and he couldn't work after he had exposed it. And this was a Polish carpenter who grew up on a farm and was convinced he was immune to any kind of mold because he does that kind of work all the time. We just all of a sudden had flu symptoms. And, I went in with a respirator on to look at it, and I still got it. My husband and my son never went into that bathroom, and they got it.
Oh.
So mold spores, an important thing to know is that mold spores in and of themselves are so tiny that we can't see them. Uh-huh. They ride on currents of air that, again, we can't see. It's like dust in the air. They ride on the back of dust spores. So anywhere that dust can go, which is pretty much anywhere, and that's what the food source was in my ductwork, was dirt and dust in the ductwork, because obviously metal is not a food source for mold. So when you know that, then you start realizing that actually mold can grow on any material and anywhere that there's potentially dirt and dust, and being that dirt and dust is biological matter. And then realizing that how pervasive this can be. And so we ultimately got rid of it, and we recovered. That bout took us about 2 weeks to get over. But it was really an eye-opener, finally, that this stuff is really, really difficult to figure out. And so in trying to figure out the health issues that we then realized that we had, and we're all doing quite well, I will say. But in realizing all the health issues and how different they were, our
Yeah.
symptoms were all different. Flu-like symptoms were kind of similar, but generally our other symptoms were very different depending on who the person was that was affected. So I realized, and we're still working on a few health issues that have been a little bit harder to resolve, and that in doing the research for that is when I realized how many people were also struggling with this.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of cases, because of the complexity, finding information that was only partially true, or even finding things that are misinformation that's being spread that is more a kind of the telephone game where maybe what started out as good information turns into something that's not really right. And so I've decided that maybe this is what I'm supposed to do, is share all this information that I've been garnering for really over the past 12 years, now the research that I've done on this topic, and share it to the other people who need it and don't have the advantage of my expertise to know where to start and how it matters, and try to ferret out some of the truth from the myth.
Sure. Well, I want to ask you about that misinformation, but before we get there, I simply want the listener to understand, and I want to as well. Most people see mold, I think, Cheryl, as an annoyance, something that's kind of smelly or bothersome, but it's much more than that, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a toxin. There's a bunch of different species of mold that actually there's more than I could label, but there's maybe 4 or 5 that are considered very toxic. And this is largely what you have to know is that mold is everywhere. I mean, it's in our environment. It's how we have dirt. The fungus is part of the natural process of decomposing natural matter. The fungus is involved. What's ended up happening is that, and this is basically an unintended consequence of the sustainability movement, I believe, that we've tightened up our buildings really tight, and the mold isn't intended to be in an enclosed space where that's all we're breathing, or what the mold spores themselves, and then some of the byproducts that they put off into the air, which are called mycotoxins, and there's some other things as well, and bacteria as well will grow. Mm-hmm. So because we have tightened up our buildings so tight, but we haven't really addressed how we build them. So there's this technology around really super tight buildings and energy efficiency, but we build them the same way we've always built them, with human beings and hammers and nails and out in the weather, and not realizing that now these super tight buildings that used to dry easily because they were drafty, mm-hmm. now aren't drying because they're not drafty anymore. Mm-hmm. And so the even small leaks that would have dried out in a drafty building now are festering. And then over time, when they can't dry out, dirt and fungus, any kind of fungus is in the air anyway that is trapped in a warm, moist place, is, like a classic, wet towel in a gym bag. You leave that in a closet for a long time and it gets nasty. Mm-hmm. And so the same thing happens in our buildings, and the air quality is what ends up suffering. We've tightened our buildings. It means the air quality is trapped. And so the question then becomes, how do you change out the air, and how do you clean the air, and how do you prevent this water damage from happening in the first place, so that we don't have to worry about drying when we're not having a drafty building that's going to help us do that. So there's a lot of mechanisms to do that. There's a lot of details to consider in building, and in considering the buildings that we live in now and are tightening up with new windows and insulation, and again, being vigilant is a big start.
We want to pause now and thank our sponsors, Green Pasture Products. Green Pasture Products produces fermented cod liver oil and concentrated butter oil in a variety of flavors in liquid gel and capsule form. They also offer organic virgin coconut oil, virgin coconut ghee, and a complete oil blend that includes all of the nourishing oils. And lastly, they produce skincare balms and various byproducts that enrich the soil and feed of farm animals. Just go to greenpastureproducts.com. And the Weston A. Price Foundation. There are lots of ways to learn from their valuable health information. Go to their Facebook page, like it, and you will get regular updates and articles in your feed. And if you haven't yet done so, go to their website, westonaprice.org, and click on Free Info Pack, a little graphic on the left-hand sidebar, and you'll get a free information packet with their dietary guidelines and information on their important work. That's at westonaprice.org. let's go back to the misinformation you were talking about. What are some of the myths out there or the partial information that is keeping this important, proper information from the public?
One of the things I think that's misinformation, and I see it everywhere, is that that you always know you have mold because you will smell it. And that's not always the case. So that would be one myth, is that definitely if you smell mold, if you smell mustiness, you do have it.
Mm-hmm.
That is a byproduct of mold, is to create something that goes into the air that causes that smell. And so that is something to be alerted to. But so one myth is that you would definitely smell it. And if you don't smell it, then you must not have it. That would not be the case. Likewise, you cannot see it and still have it, because it can be behind the wall in a place that can go on for a long period of time before you're actually exposed. And so a myth might be, well, it's behind the drywall, or it's behind the wood floor, or under the carpet or something, so we can't see it, and so I'm not affected. Well, that would be another myth, that actually mold is always trying to reproduce itself. So it puts out spores into the air, much like a plant has pollen, and it puts out spores in the air, especially as it's dying. So once it starts to dry out, it's like, oh no, I have to recreate my species. So let's throw out some more spores, and hope they land somewhere where we can continue to grow and that I don't die out. That's the mind of the mold spore. Mm-hmm. And so they're so small, and the mycotoxins in particular are a byproduct of the mold spores, and that goes anywhere where air goes. So unless you were to live in an airtight building, and we actually don't live in airtight buildings, that would be like being in space, So another myth would be, okay, well, the dirt in my crawl spaces is separated from my house from the floor. And I've sealed up, and you try to caulk all those openings between the crawl space and my building and my home. So I shouldn't be feeling exposed to that. And again, that's not exactly true either. And the way you can test that is you can go use an incense stick or something and put that under there. Or, as many people have discovered, if you have an animal die under your crawl space, under your home, eventually you start smelling it, because the air currents, there's tiny gaps, construction gaps, that air can move through. And so we're never really building something that's truly airtight. If that were the case, if you were running your exhaust fan, you would be able to suck all the air out and it would be a vacuum inside. But that would never happen. But speaking of that, that's part of the reason the exhaust fan is part of the reason why they're not airtight, is because we exhaust air out when we cook, when we run our dryers. Bathroom fans, which we should be exhausted out. And when you blow air out of a building, then makeup air has to come in, because the building is trying to create and remain at equilibrium.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to me. I was just going to say that your background as an architect is really coming into play here, isn't it? As you have a better understanding than most of us of how buildings are designed and where they might harbor mold.
Yes, and that's how I even found my mold that I had in my house, because I knew what I had done in terms of design that was right, and that couldn't be a case, although I could still check those things. But I also knew where the plumbing was going. I knew where possible. I also knew water travels, and that's another thing people have to understand is, so in my case, we had a plumbing leak. Sort of. It wasn't actually a pipe that was leaking. It was water that was getting behind the wall near plumbing. We had two places, actually, a toilet seal and a shower valve. But the water will travel. And so sometimes when you're looking for a leak, you have to be careful to know that just because you can see something is damaged there, or there's a hole in the roof, or that doesn't mean that that's where the water ended up. Water will follow the path of least resistance and gravity, and sometimes it can travel a very long way without causing any damage before it hits a block in a place where it stops, and then that's where the damage begins. And that was the case in my bathroom, was that the water traveled fine without it causing any problem through the wall. And wood is actually quite resilient that way, and that's another myth, is that if wood gets wet immediately, it's going to get moldy. That's not the case, actually. Drywall, on the other hand, that is true, that drywall materials, you have 12 or 24 hours to get rid of them or get them dried out completely before you need to be concerned about possible bacteria or mold growing.
Hey, Cheryl, I think I have another myth. I've heard people say, well, if you see mold, let's say, growing in a corner of one of your rooms or something, you can wipe it down with chlorine or Clorox bleach or something and remediate it that way. But I understand that's really insufficient.
Oh, yeah, that is probably the biggest myth of all. I'm glad you mentioned that. Using bleach for mold, that is definitely not something that is recommended. It's actually not recommended by OSHA anymore or the EPA. But what I think it might have been at one point, because there's so many agencies that quote using bleach, that I wonder if they didn't at one point recommend using bleach and then realized that it was a mistake to do that and then pulled back off of it, but didn't put up a big flag and say, hey, whoa, everybody, we changed our recommendations.
Oh.
We're not actually recommending that anymore. So the reason not to use bleach is because bleach is actually 3 to 6% sodium hypochlorite. That's the active part, which means it's 94 to 97% water. Okay, what's the food source for mold? Well, it's a biological matter, oxygen, which is everywhere. It's also moisture. So you're adding water to something that you're trying to get rid of. That's mold.
You're feeding it, basically. You're feeding it.
Yes. So what happens is that sodium hypochlorite, the bleach portion, evaporates faster than the water.
Oh.
So it will kill the mold on the surface and then immediately evaporates. But know also that chlorine gas is kind of toxic too, so that's also a problem. But so it immediately is evaporating. You got to avoid breathing it because it's toxic to people. But in the meantime, the water is staying where isn't evaporating as quickly. And then especially porous materials, and the porous materials are everything from masonry, concrete, wood, fabrics for sure, drywall. Absolutely. The paper on drywall, the plaster board, the gypsum are all porous, which means they absorb water. So think about it. So you wash off the surface with chlorine bleach, the bleach part evaporates. The 97% that's left is water that's soaking in. And so it looks like the surface, you got rid of the mold. What you actually did was feed the roots of the mold beneath the surface. And so the mold will now come back and rebound faster and bigger and better than it was before because it just had a great big drink of water.
Oh, no. So this is a great place, because we are getting close to the end of our time, for us to talk about how can we be vigilant then? What are some things we can do? What are some tools that will be more effective than bleach for mold remediation?
Well, for mold remediation, first of all, always know that you have to find the source. Why do you have mold in the first place? Because you can clean, and cleaning generally you can be done with detergent and water. Again, the water you want to use as minimal amount as possible and dry anything that you're using water with. But detergent, borax, vinegar gets used frequently. There's some other cleaners. Be careful with chemicals. Some chemicals can be more toxic than the mold itself. Also know that whatever detergent that you're cleaning with is not going to kill, and the bleach, this is the same for bleach, does not kill the mold spores in the air. So you may have cleaned it off of a surface, but whatever's in the air is going to re-land eventually and then have the opportunity to grow. And so my point is, if you do see mold somewhere, it's fine to clean it off, but don't stop there. And then the challenge is to figure out, why do I have mold there? Because it shouldn't be there. It's not a normal component of a building. Mm-hmm. It means there's mold spores in the air that have landed there now where you can see it, but that means there's probably somewhere else that you can't. And where is the source of the water? Because it always has something to do with water. Even you hear about dry rot. Dry rot is water. It comes from water damage. It's not completely dry. So now that material can dry out, but at some point there has to be water. And so that's the detective work that needs to be done. And sometimes a professional needs to help do that. I would say generally check your humidity levels. In the winter in North America, when you're in a heating season, under 45% should be the goal of your humidity in your space, and check each room separately. In an air conditioning season, when it's humid outside, the goal is realistically under 50 to 55%. It's a little bit harder to get the moisture down. Yeah. But still shooting for 40%. And then again, this is how I found mine, was I had one room that had close to 70% humidity compared to all the other rooms. And so then you have to say, why would that be?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that kind of is the wet towel in the gym bag thing. There's got to be something wet there that's stored moisture that's trying to dry out that moisture all the time and raising the humidity in that room. So anyway, humidity monitors are $8 to $12. You know, get it at Amazon, Walmart, Home Depot, all those stores. You can measure the outside versus the inside to compare. There's also things that are called surface moisture meters. I have pin type as well. Those are expensive and not for your average homeowner, but a surface one might be helpful if you know where to look. There's things like water alarms that are cheap that you can buy under $20 that have a sensor that'll tell you if something is ever leaking, which you can put by a sump pump or in places under your dishwasher is a good place to have one just kind of parked and hidden.
Mm-hmm.
Checking things like toilet seal leaks, looking around your toilets for any sign of anything that looks different. So looking for things like buckling paint, bubbling paint, anything that looks chalky. Sometimes on a surface of drywall will look sparkly in one place. That's not normal. Any discoloration should be investigated.
So it sounds like there are so many ways for us to stay vigilant. I bet you have resources on your website that our listeners could check into too to know how to go about this, right?
Yes, I'm just started my website not too long ago, so I'm filling it up more and more, but it's avoidingmold.com. And in the blog section is where when I have commonly asked questions, I go there and try to answer them to be a resource for everybody, because I keep getting a lot of the same questions. But say the one other thing I just want to quick mention is your gutters. Check your gutters and downspouts, and then finally walk around when you're home when it's raining. Put your raincoat on, your rain boots, get an umbrella, walk around when it's raining, and look for any puddling or pooling of water up against your home, because that's not the way that's never going to end well. Avoidingmold.com, and I have a Facebook group called Water Damage and Mold in Buildings, where I try to keep it science-based and share information there and help people with their questions. And I hope to do a book fairly soon to kind of consolidate all this information into one place.
Fantastic. Well, as we wrap up, Cheryl, my final question to you is, what is one thing that you would recommend the listener do to improve their health? Consider
their environment. I think so much that you do with Weston Price with food, and definitely we've gotten better with food as part of it. So if you're doing everything right, food and nutrition and supplements or taking good care of yourself and exercise, and you're still struggling, consider your environment, because it can be insidious, and there can be places in your environment at work, or at home, that might be compromising your immune system without you realizing it.
Well, that is a great word. Thank you so much for your time today, Cheryl.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
My guest today was Cheryl Ciecko. Find out more about Cheryl and her work at her website, cherylciecko.wixsite.com, which is actually called Dwelling Well in a Toxic World, or go to avoidingmold.com, or simply go to our website, westonaprice.org, and click on the show notes for episode 49. Hey, and a quick thank you to my friends at Podcast Village. Marcus, Sarah, Charlie, you all are the best. Thank you for your editing and production support.
Did you know that there are Weston A. Price Foundation chapters all over the U.S. and around the world? Chapter leaders help you find good food in your area, and some have meetings you can attend. Go to our website, westonaprice.org, and click on Find a Local Chapter to see if there is one near you. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. The content of this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.